The townsfolk drifted nearby like shadows with opinions. A man hitching his mule paused long enough to mutter that the mail-order girl's been tricked,
Not alone.
looks like. A group of women whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes sharp as sewing needles. Children, braver in their curiosity, lingered too close until their mothers tugged them away. Every sound seemed exaggerated in the thin morning air. The scrape of boots, the rattle of wagon wheels, the sighs of those who didn't know her but judged her anyway. Li Mei remained still, each whisper a stone placed quietly on her back. She had come so far for a name promised in ink. Now she carried only silence. Across the road, Rowan Tate stepped out of his wagon after loading supplies. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the steady movements of a man used to winter's temper, he watched her the way one watches a wounded creature, carefully, respectfully, without sudden approach. His coat was dusted with snow, his breath faint clouds in the cold. He didn't know her story, but something in her trembling stance tugged at an old ache he had trained himself to forget. He rested an elbow on the wagon rail, eyes narrowed against the wind, quietly taking in the way she tried to hide her shivering. When the station clerk finally emerged, wiping ink from his fingers, he cleared his throat and said the word she feared. "Ma'am, seems the gentleman who sent for you isn't coming today." He didn't finish with reassurance. The West seldom offered any. Li Mei lowered her gaze, though it had already been low enough. The wind lifted a strand of her hair like it meant to comfort her. It didn't. Her voice was barely audible when she asked, "Is there somewhere I can wait?" The clerk scratched his chin and gestured toward a small boarding room left unused since autumn. "You can shelter there for now," he offered, and she nodded, her gratitude too small to show. As she walked toward the narrow structure, Rowan noticed how she clutched her bundle as though it contained all her worth. People stepped aside but never toward her. Shame has a scent, faint as ash. The town could smell it. He almost followed, but stopped himself. Some storms, he'd learned, you don't interrupt until the lightning decides where to strike. Through the window of the boarding room that night, her lantern glowed softly. Rowan saw her silhouette kneeling, hands moving slowly, prayer or quiet repair, he couldn't tell. The snow piled higher, hours heavy with the kind of loneliness that carried its own chill. He wondered if anyone awaited her back in the lands she left. He wondered if she would survive the winter with nothing but a thin dress and a thinner faith in strangers. Morning arrived raw and brittle. Li Mei stepped outside with her bundle, resolve pressed into every breath she took. Her eyes were red but steady. She moved with a grace that looked practiced, the kind born from surviving disappointment more than once. She whispered something in her own language, words shaped like farewell, Rowan imagined. The sheriff, Marshal Briggs, approached her with a furrowed brow, asking gently if she needed help, but she only bowed and thanked him. "I will go," she said. "I do not wish to cause trouble." Trouble had already begun. Clive Turner, a ranch hand whose voice carried farther than his usefulness, leaned against a post and laughed loudly. "Ain't no one gonna take her in," he announced to anyone who'd listen. "Should have stayed where she came from." The cruelty was careless, tossed like gravel under a wagon wheel. Li Mei froze for a heartbeat, but she didn't turn. Pride held her upright even as shame gnawed at her ribs. Rowan, loading the last of his supplies, heard Clive's laugh echo like a slap. He looked toward the small figure standing at the edge of the street, her breath forming fragile clouds that disappeared too quickly. Something tightened in him, an old instinct, the one that made him step between harm and whatever deserved gentleness. He took a step toward her but stopped again, jaw clenched. He didn't know her. He had no right to decide anything for her. Yet watching her walk alone into the white horizon felt wrong in a way that scraped bone. Li Mei reached the crossroads just beyond the station. Snow crunched beneath her thin shoes. A wagon passed, its driver not even glancing her way. She paused, breath shaking, as if the cold seeped into the very places where hope used to live. She looked back once, not toward the townspeople, not toward the sheriff, not toward the building that had sheltered her, but toward the direction where Rowan Tate stood behind his wagon. She did not expect rescue. She only wondered if the world might look back at her one last time. Rowan met her gaze across the pale distance. It lasted only a second, but it was enough for him to read something quiet and devastating in her eyes, something he recognized from his own reflection on certain nights, a belief that one's presence was more burden than blessing. She lowered her head and turned away. The wind picked up, scattering loose snow like restless spirits. Rowan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him as if he were letting go of a life he'd kept too small for too long. He watched her shrinking figure until she was almost a smudge against the vast white plain. The world around him felt suddenly hollow, as though someone had removed a beam from a house and the structure had not yet realized it would collapse. He took another step forward, boots crunching into frost. The wagon, the supplies, the safe routine of his day, all of it receded behind him. Something larger, quieter, more insistent pulled him toward the crossroads where she walked. The old soul of the story, the one neither of them knew yet, leaned closer to listen. Just as Li Mei reached the bend in the road, the first vicious gust of the coming storm swept across the land, bending the tall grasses and snatching her balance. She steadied herself, but her bundle slipped, landing in the snow. And Rowan Tate finally began to move. The wind pushed against Rowan as he crossed the frozen stretch toward her, each step taken with the steady certainty of a man who had decided long before his mind admitted it. Li Mei bent to retrieve her fallen bundle, fingers shaking from cold more than panic, though panic lived beneath her skin like a trapped bird. When she straightened, the storm lifted her hair and brushed it across her face in dark ribbons, softening her features even as fear tightened her voice. "Please," she whispered when she saw him coming, "I do not wish to bother anyone." Yet her words trembled in the air, fragile as frost flowers on winter windows. Rowan stopped a few paces from her, breath rising in pale clouds. He wasn't a man known for long speeches. His silence usually meant distance, not indecision, but now it carried something else, an internal shift, quiet and unyielding. Snow hissed between them as though urging one of them to speak, to decide what the rest of the day, and perhaps the rest of their lives, would become. "Cold's grown mean," he said finally, voice low as a worn fiddle string. "Storm's coming fast. You won't make it far." She shook her head, clutching her bundle to her chest, insisting softly, "I must go. I cannot stay where I am not wanted." The words slipped out with a trembling sincerity that made Rowan look away for a heartbeat, ashamed at the world she had walked into. "Ain't about want," he murmured. "It's about surviving the day." But she turned from him, taking 3 unsteady steps toward the long white road. The wind caught her skirt, lifting the hem like it meant to drag her along. Rowan stepped in front of her without thinking, his shadow falling over her like a shield. "At least take this." He unbuttoned his coat, thick, woolen, warm from his body, and wrapped it over her shoulders before she could refuse. She inhaled sharply at the weight, the warmth, the unexpected gentleness. "I cannot," she said. "People already look. People look at anything they don't understand," he answered. "Coat won't change that." For a moment, neither moved. Snowflakes gathered in her lashes, shimmering like small truths she hadn't meant to reveal. Rowan didn't reach out, didn't touch her, didn't try to persuade her with anything beyond the simple fact that she was freezing. His restraint was more tender than any embrace could have been. But the town did not offer such understanding. Behind them, a creaking wagon wheel and a familiar voice cut through the wind. Clive Turner had arrived early to spread whatever poison he considered conversation. "Well, look at that," he called, smirking as he leaned against his saddle. Rancher Tate found himself a lost pet. Li Mei flinched, and Rowan's jaw hardened enough to crack stone. He didn't look back, didn't dignify Clive with the time of day, but Li Mei heard the whisper of his breath, anger tempered by effort. She bowed her head, cheeks burning beneath the cold. "See," she murmured. "I cannot stay." Rowan felt something inside him stir at that, something that had long slept under years of solitude. "Clive talks more than he thinks," he said. "Don't let a fool write your story." She blinked up at him, eyes glossy with cold and shame. "My story is already broken." Her voice cracked, but she steadied it quickly, as someone who has had to rebuild her dignity too many times. Rowan studied her, trying to understand the weight behind her words, but she gave him no more. Instead she took a single step backward, ready to slip away into the storm. He looked at the road behind her, long, merciless, disappearing into a sky waiting to bury anything small enough to vanish. "Come with me," he said, not as command, not even as invitation, but as acknowledgment of what the storm and the gossip would do to her. Just until the weather eases. She hesitated, shoulders lifting with the faintest breath of disbelief. Your house, she began, but he interrupted gently. Ain't a house that'll mind sheltering someone in need. His tone carried a soft finality, the kind of truth a man didn't withdraw once spoken. She searched his face, looking not for promises but for hidden costs, and found none. Slowly, she nodded, though her eyes betrayed the fear of stepping into yet another unknown. Rowan didn't reach for her hand. He simply walked beside her, matching her pace as though the snow would swallow either of them if they moved apart. They passed the last building of town where Martha Ellery stood sweeping her porch. She paused, gaze lingering on the fragile woman wrapped in Rowan's coat. There was no mockery in her eyes, only a quiet question. Rowan tipped his hat in greeting. Martha offered a small, sympathetic nod toward Lee, a gesture that warmed more than the coat did. But Clive Turner's final jeer echoed behind them. Storm'll sort it out. Rowan stopped for a fraction of a second, breath hitching with the impulse to turn and shut the man up. Instead he forced the anger down, stepped forward again, and let the storm swallow Clive's voice entirely. By the time they reached Rowan's wagon, Lee steps had grown unsteady. She tried to climb onto the seat but slipped. Rowan caught her by the elbow, steadying her without tightening his grip. She withdrew quickly, cheeks flushed beneath the frost. He pretended not to notice. You'll ride, he said, handing her a blanket. I'll walk beside. Horses handle better if weight's even. She knew he was lying for her dignity, but she accepted the gesture, tucking it quietly into her heart. The journey to his ranch was slow, snow gathering around their boots and wagon wheels like time layering over something precious. Lee watched Rowan as he walked beside the horse, head bowed against the wind, as though protecting far more than just her travel. She wondered why a man who seemed carved from silence would offer kindness when others offered cruelty. She wondered what loneliness lived behind his steady blue eyes, and whether it resembled her own. When they reached his cabin, wooden, weathered, but sturdy, Rowan opened the door and stepped aside. Warmth spilled out, scented with cedar smoke and quiet living. She hesitated on the threshold, as though entering might bind her fate in ways she couldn't yet name. Rowan waited without pressure, his stillness an invitation rather than insistence. Finally she crossed into the dim firelight, placing her bundle near the wall. The wind howled against the cabin as Rowan closed the door, sealing out the cold, and perhaps something else. Lee removed the coat slowly, folding it with both reverence and uncertainty. Just until the storm passes, she murmured. Rowan nodded, though something unreadable flickered in his expression, a shadow of a truth not yet spoken. And then the lantern flickered once, just once, as if warning them that storms come in more shapes than weather. The cabin breathed with a warmth Lee had not felt in weeks, a gentle glow from the hearth casting amber ribbons across the wooden floor. She stood just inside the doorway, letting the heat seep into her fingers, half afraid it would vanish if she relaxed too much. Rowan hung his hat on the peg near the door and brushed melting snow from his shoulders. His movements were steady, almost ritualistic, as though he had lived alone for so long that routine had hardened into instinct. He glanced toward her, eyes soft but unreadable. "Fire'll hold steady a while," he murmured, voice low enough to blend with the crackling wood. "Warm yourself." She nodded, folding the blanket he had offered earlier and placing it on a chair with careful precision, as though tidiness might repay the debt she felt she had already become. She watched Rowan move about the room, lighting another lantern, setting a kettle on the stove, clearing space at the table. Not in a hurry, not avoiding her, simply living in his quiet way. Something about his stillness made the cabin feel safer than she expected. The storm scratched at the windows like a restless creature, but inside, time slowed. Each breath she drew felt heavier, as if thawing carried its own weight. She traced her fingertips along the frayed edge of her sleeve and whispered, half to herself, "I am only here for the storm." Rowan looked over, brow furrowing gently. "Storm'll take its time," he said. "You don't owe me anything but staying warm." His words struck deeper than she meant them to. In her experience, kindness always arrived with obligations hidden beneath it. Yet Rowan offered nothing but space. A kettle whistle filled the room, He poured hot water into a tin cup and slid it toward her. "Ginger root," he said. "Good for cold." She accepted it with both hands, inhaling steam scented with earth and quiet comfort. She did not drink immediately. Instead she lifted her eyes to him, trying to understand why he was different from every other stranger she had met in this harsh land. "Why help me?" she asked softly. Rowan leaned against the counter, arms folded, gaze drifting toward the window fogged by snow. "Because someone should have," he answered simply. She swallowed, unsure how to respond. Her heart tightened with a mixture of warmth and fear. Gratitude was dangerous. It tethered her to places she wasn't meant to stay. She turned from him, walked toward the window, and rested her palm lightly against the chilled glass. Outside, the snow swirled in ghostly spirals, a world erased and remade in white. A memory flickered, her mother's voice urging her to be courageous, to find her own path, even if it meant leaving everything familiar behind. But courage had never felt so fragile. Rowan stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance. "Town'll talk," he said quietly. "But they talk about anything that ain't their own reflection." She lifted her chin slightly, bracing for what she expected next, a warning that she should leave soon, or that he didn't want trouble. "Instead," Rowan added, "what they say ain't what defines someone." She let out a shakier breath than she intended. Shame lived close to the surface, always waiting to be stirred. "They think I bring misfortune," she murmured. "That any man who takes me in will suffer." Rowan's jaw tightened. Superstition's a fool's excuse to be cruel. "You didn't cause your hardships." The conviction in his voice startled her. She turned, meeting his gaze. Firelight warmed one side of his face. The other remained shadowed, hinting at a life that had known its own storms. There was no pity in his expression, only a kind of quiet respect, as though he saw strength in her that she had forgotten. She held his gaze a moment too long, then lowered her eyes, cheeks warming. "I do not want to trouble you," she whispered. "You're not," he replied, gently enough for the words to land like reassurance rather than argument. A silence settled between them, not awkward but delicate, like a bridge forming itself one plank at a time. Rowan moved toward the door next, pulling on his gloves. "I'll fetch more wood before the wind worsens." She straightened immediately. "I can help." He shook his head. "You rest. Long journeys written all over you." She hesitated, then stepped forward anyway, reaching for her thin shawl. "Please," she said softly. "Let me do something." Her insistence had no sharpness, only the quiet desperation of someone who feared becoming a burden. Rowan regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But stay close." Outside, the cold bit at her cheeks, but she followed him to the woodpile behind the cabin. Snowflakes clung to her hair like tiny white blossoms. Rowan handed her smaller logs, ones she could carry without straining. She gathered them carefully, as though each held significance. The wind whipped around them, rattling branches overhead. "You don't have to prove anything," Rowan said suddenly, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. She paused mid-step. "I am only trying to repay kindness." Rowan shook his head, shoulders lifting with a restrained sigh. "Kindness ain't a debt. It's a choice." The words pressed against something tender inside her. She returned to the cabin, arms full, breath trembling. When the door closed behind them, the warmth enveloped her again, almost painfully comforting. She set the logs near the stove, her fingers brushing the floorboards. The simple act, helping, contributing, felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Rowan offered a faint smile, the kind that flickered like a candle flame. "Thank you," he said, voice quiet but sincere. Her chest ached unexpectedly. It had been so long since anyone had thanked her without expectation or suspicion. She bowed her head. "You are welcome." Evening deepened, shadows stretching across the cabin as the fire glowed brighter. Rowan cooked a simple meal, beans, bread warmed on the stove, a sliver of salted meat he insisted she take. They ate in a silence shaped not by discomfort but by slow-growing trust. Each small gesture, passing a dish, offering more water, adjusting a chair, wove an invisible thread between them. When he finally rose to check the shutters, Li Mei watched him with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. She could feel something shifting beneath the surface of her fear, something she dared not name. Rowan paused at the window, hand resting on the wooden frame. "Wind's picking up," he said. "Storm's far from done." She nodded, fingers tightening around her cup. Then, almost reluctantly, she asked, "And tomorrow? What then?" Rowan turned toward her, expression unreadable in the half-light. He opened his mouth to answer, but the sudden pounding of fists against the cabin door cut him off, echoing through the room like a warning no one could ignore. Rowan moved toward the door with the steady caution of a man who had weathered too many storms, but the pounding on the wood carried an edge that told him this was no ordinary visit. Li Mei stiffened where she stood, her fingers tightening around the cup as though bracing herself against a blow she already recognized. The storm rattled the shutters, but the knock was louder, sharper, born not of weather but of men who carry judgment in their boots. Rowan opened the door just enough to see Clive Turner standing on the porch with two ranch hands flanking him, their faces tight with the kind of superiority that grows in empty hearts. Clive didn't bother hiding his smirk as he leaned forward, boots planted wide against the creeping snow. He jerked his chin toward Li Mei, who hovered near the stove like a shadow trying to stay small enough to escape notice. "Heard you've taken in the stray," Clive drawled, letting the syllables drip like venom onto Rowan's floorboards. "Town's got questions about why a man like you would harbor trouble that's already been passed over by wiser folks." Rowan felt the insult aimed not just at Li Mei but at the decency he chose to show her, a decency Clive mistook for weakness. He stepped outside, pulling the door nearly shut behind him to shield Li Mei from the cold stares gathering on the porch. "She is my guest," Rowan said, voice low but edged with steel, a tone he rarely used unless pushed beyond patience. Clive laughed, brittle as thin ice. He spread his arms wide as if presenting the wind-beaten world itself. "Ain't no one in town who wants her here. Best let her move on before she drags you down too." Inside, Li Mei heard every word, the cracks in the doorframe offering no protection from the cruelty that insisted on naming her before she could name herself. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her sleeve as though holding herself together required both hands. Rowan stepped closer to Clive, the heat rising from him not from anger but from the tired knowledge that people like Clive made the world harder for those who already carried enough sorrow. "Leave my land," Rowan said. "Storm's coming. Go home." Clive spat into the snow, then leaned in just enough for his voice to drop into a hiss. "You think sheltering her will change anything? You're fooling yourself." He turned abruptly, motioning for his men to follow, their boots crunching angrily down the path as the wind swallowed their shapes. Only when their silhouettes vanished into the white blur did Rowan re-enter the cabin, a heaviness clinging to him like wet wool. Li Mei stood near the stove, her eyes wide not with fear but with the guilt of someone who believed she had brought misfortune through mere existence. "I should go," she whispered, the words trembling as though pulled from the depth of old wounds. "I have caused enough." Rowan removed his gloves slowly, placing them on the table with deliberate care, as if choosing each gesture could somehow steady her breaking heart. He met her gaze, the blue of his eyes softened by a resolve she didn't yet understand. "You didn't cause this," he said quietly. "Clive's cruelty ain't yours to carry." She shook her head, the movement small but filled with the weight of years spent apologizing for simply being alive. "Everywhere I go," she murmured, "someone decides I bring harm." Her voice cracked on the last word, a fracture fine enough to miss unless one listened with the heart instead of the ears, something Rowan had learned long ago. He stepped closer, but not enough to crowd her, leaving space for her fear to breathe. "If you leave now," he said, "you know the storm will take you before sunrise." She lowered her gaze, watching the shadows tremble on the floor as though they, too, were uncertain which direction to take. He added, "But if you stay because you choose to, not because I asked." The cabin settled into a silence so full it pressed against their ribs, a silence that held possibility and terror in equal measure. Li Mei touched the pocket of her dress where she kept the single letter that had promised her a future that had dissolved the moment she stepped off the train. She lifted her eyes to him again, vulnerability shimmering like a candle fighting against the dark. "How long will the storm last?" Rowan breathed in slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he knows truth may wound but must still be spoken. "Long enough," he said, That leaving ain't safe. Her shoulders slumped, not in defeat but in surrender to a truth she had tried to outrun since arriving in this unforgiving land. Before she could respond, a sudden gust slammed against the walls, making the lantern flicker violently, shadows snapping like startled birds. Rowan's gaze cut to the window, where the storm reared higher, but something else caught his attention. Footprints appearing in the snow just beyond the porch, fresh and unsteady, as though someone had approached the cabin only moments ago, then vanished into the dark. Li Mei drew closer to the hearth, unaware of the tension tightening Rowan's frame as he stared at the half-filled tracks dissolving under fresh snow. Something in their crooked pattern hinted at desperation rather than mere curiosity, as though whoever had left them had stood watching the cabin with intention heavy as the storm itself. Rowan stepped forward instinctively, his shadow stretching across the floorboards like a warning. He didn't speak, but Li Mei felt the shift in the air, a quiet dread curling around the room, telling her that the night held more than wind waiting outside. Something unseen pressed against their fate, urging the darkness nearer, as though the storm itself carried a watching presence. The storm deepened its howl as Rowan stepped toward the window, his breath fogging the cold glass while his eyes narrowed at the half-vanished footprints outside. They were too close to the cabin, too recent to dismiss, and shaped by someone who had paused long enough to watch. The wind tried to erase the tracks, but it had not been fast enough to hide the truth. Someone had stood at the edge of Rowan's porch, close enough to hear voices, close enough to carry intention. He felt Li Mei's presence behind him, light as a shadow yet filled with quiet dread. She clasped her hands together, not knowing whether to speak, not wanting to disturb the fragile equilibrium that held the room together. "Is it them?" she whispered, her voice barely rising above the crackle of the fire. Rowan turned, his expression steady but shadowed with concern. "Maybe just a traveler caught in the weather," he answered, though he knew it was unlikely. No one wandered this far off the main road unless they meant to. The thought of Clive returning in secret flickered through his mind like lightning behind clouds, but he tucked it away, unwilling to burden her with fear. Her shoulders were already trembling beneath the weight of too many winters she hadn't chosen to face. Rowan stepped away from the window and knelt to place another log on the fire. Sparks rose, swirling upward like fleeting stars before dimming into soot. The warmth surged through the cabin, brushing Li Mei's cheeks and coaxing life back into her fingertips. She watched Rowan's hands, large, calloused, gentle, moving with a care that didn't match his reputation as a solitary man hardened by loss. He glanced up briefly, catching the way she studied him, and the faintest shift softened his gaze. "You're safe here," he murmured. "I won't let harm find you." Li Mei lowered her eyes, unsure how to hold that kind of assurance. Safety, in her experience, was a temporary shelter at best, a thin roof over promise that could collapse at any moment. Yet Rowan's voice settled inside her, a small ember that refused to die out no matter how many storms had passed through her life. She took a slow breath, courage gathering in her chest. "I have never been safe anywhere," she admitted softly. "Not truly. Not since I left home." Rowan rose, his movements unhurried, and stood before her. The lantern behind him outlined the broad silhouette of a man who had spent years keeping the world at arm's length. Yet now he reached for something fragile in the dim light, her trust. "Then let this be different," he said. She looked up, startled by the sincerity woven into his voice, like warmth hidden beneath winter bark. Before she could speak, the wind surged violently, slamming against the door with enough force to jolt her backward. Rowan reacted instantly, striding across the room to brace the latch. The shutters rattled, snow filtering through the cracks like whispers of the cold world outside. Li Mei flinched at the sound, her breath catching. Rowan glanced over his shoulder, offering a reassuring nod, but tension coiled in his shoulders as another gust hit the door, this time sharper, as if accompanied by an intentional thud. Li Mei's pulse sped. "Someone is out there," she breathed, stepping closer to Rowan, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. Rowan nodded once, the understanding settling between them like a silent vow. He retrieved his rifle from beside the hearth, not with haste, not with fear, but with the calm of a man who had lived long enough to know when to show strength. He cracked the door open only an inch, peering into the storm. Snow swirled fiercely, obscuring shapes, but he saw enough. A dark figure retreating toward the trees, moving quickly but limping, as though wounded or chilled to the bone. He shut the door and secured the latch. "Not Clive," he said slowly. "Someone else." Li Mei stared at him, confusion mingling with fear. Why would a stranger come here? Rowan shook his head. Might have been watching since earlier. Maybe thought the cabin was empty. The truth was murkier. Whoever it was had left too quietly to be a harmless wanderer. But the danger was fading into the storm, and Rowan would not leave Li Mei alone to chase shadows. As he turned back toward her, she stepped in front of him, her hands half raised as though trying to shield him from imagined harm. "Please," she whispered, "don't go out. Don't leave me." The plea slipped from her lips before she could stop it, raw and trembling. Rowan's breath hitched, not from the storm, but from the trust she had unknowingly placed in him. He set the rifle aside and gently rested a hand near her shoulder without touching, giving her the choice to close the distance or step away. She didn't move. "I'm here," he said quietly. "You're not alone tonight." Her eyes glistened as she searched his face, seeing no expectation, no ownership, just presence. Something inside her softened, settling into a place she had never allowed herself to rest. The storm roared, but the world inside the cabin felt smaller, safer, shaped by the warmth of two people learning how to breathe again. Rowan guided her back to the hearth, motioning for her to sit. She obeyed, her posture still elegant despite exhaustion. He poured warm water into the tin cup, adding another sliver of ginger. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his briefly, too brief to be intentional, too meaningful to be ignored. A spark passed between them, subtle yet undeniable, like the brief flare of embers before they catch. They sat in quiet for a long moment, the silence layered with everything they could not say aloud. Li Mei watched the flames curl upward, painting the room in shifting gold. "I used to believe," she said slowly, "that if I tried hard enough, if I worked, obeyed, smiled, someone would finally want me." Her voice trembled with shame she had tried her whole life to bury. Rowan's gaze softened with a painful tenderness. "You ain't something to earn," he said. "You're someone." Tears formed before she could stop them, warm trails on chilled skin. Rowan didn't reach for her. He let her weep quietly, understanding that dignity grows in spaces where grief is allowed to breathe. Hours passed, the storm thrashing against the cabin with relentless intent, until the world outside seemed carved from nothing but wind and darkness. Li Mei's breathing steadied, though her eyes still carried an echo of the storm she'd endured inside her own ribs. Rowan rose to inspect the windows once more, making sure the shutters held. When he turned back toward her, he saw it, her bundle resting beside the door, tied neatly as it had been when she planned to walk away. The sight struck him, sharp as cold. "You were still planning to leave," he murmured, understanding dawning slow and deep. Li Mei didn't deny it. She nodded, lowering her gaze. "I do not belong here. People will suffer because of me." Rowan stepped forward, his expression resolute, shaped by the silent battle he had fought for hours while sitting beside her. "Listen to me," he said, voice carrying the weight of a truth he could no longer hold back. "You walk out that door, the storm will bury you. And even if it didn't, I would never forgive myself for letting you believe you had to face the world alone." Her breath caught, the smallest gasp slipping between parted lips as something inside her cracked open. Fear mixed with longing, doubt tangled with the possibility of being cared for. He moved to the door and placed his hand firmly on the latch. Then, with deliberate, unmistakable clarity, he slid the heavy wooden bar across it, sealing the storm out and sealing her fate inside the warmth of the cabin. "You're not leaving," Rowan said softly, not as a command, but as a promise. "Not alone." Li Mei pressed a trembling hand to her chest, overwhelmed by a truth she'd never dared to hope for. The fire popped, sending a single spark upward, and in that suspended instant, she realized something inside her had shifted forever. But before she could speak, before she could say the words rising in her throat, a distant cry echoed from beyond the cabin walls, faint yet unmistakable, carried on the wind like a warning that the night still held one last reckoning.